Blue Beetle's marketing strategy has completely failed. The focus on identity politics did not pan out for the film's opening weekend box office. The opening weekend haul actually performed worse than projections. Let's get into this here. According to the numbers, Blue Beetle brought in $25.4 million at the domestic box office. It did another $18 million at the international box office for a global gross of $43 million. While the film's box office numbers are exceptionally poor, it did become the highest grossing film, unseating Barbie, which only brought in $21.5 million. So it is the highest grossing for this weekend. This is the second worst opening weekend box office for a DC film since the DC Extended Universe launch of Man of Steel. The only film Blue Beetle best is Wonder Woman 1984, which had a day-and-date release on HBO Max, which means it released to theaters the same day it was available to stream on HBO Max. Wonder Woman 1984's opening weekend was $16.7 million domestic. Given Blue Beetle had the second worst opening weekend, that means it fared worse than the recently released The Flash, which only had a $55 million opening, as well as Shazam! Fury of the Gods. The Zachary Levi-led movie had an opening of $30.1 million. So this poor opening weekend box office underperformed projections from both Deadline's Anthony D'Alessandro and barely edged out Variety's Rebecca Rubin. If the early estimates hold, D'Alessandro predicted the film would gross between $28 million and $32 million domestically in its opening weekend. Obviously, $25 million is less than that. He specifically noted that the movie was, quote, over-indexing with Latino and Hispanic audiences, and thus there is a hope, quote, that there will be plenty of walk-up business. Clearly, there was not. Rubin predicted the movie would gross between $25 million and $32 million. So if those early estimates hold, it barely edged the lower numbers of her predictions. The one predictor where it did fall in line was Sean Robbins at Box Office Pro. He predicted the movie would do between $22 million and $32 million, so $25 million is obviously in there. Obviously, he has a much larger range there as well. However, like D'Alessandro, he asserted the movie had, quote, potential to over-index among Hispanic families that could help Blue Beetle come in slightly above what have until recently been bearish tracking ranges. It clearly did not. Again, there was no walk-up audience from Latinos and Hispanics that was driving it over their predictions. He did seem to indicate it would fare worse than Shazam! Fury of the Gods when he made his initial predictions, saying that pre-sales were behind the Zachary Levi starring film, and indeed it came below that movie. So let's go through how this film was marketed and how it did not work. And I know this isn't just the main reason. I know that there's the whole Batman is the fascist line that was out there as well. The director kind of doubling down on that, making fun of potential moviegoers and audiences, mocking them with He-Man, Skeletor memes, etc., etc. I get that that's out there, but I do want to point out that this was a major part of their marketing initiative, was this focus on identity politics, on Latinos. So you had Xolo Mariduena tell Empire back in June, the goal is to create a movie for a young me and a young Angel Manuel Soto, the film's director, that said, hey man, someone who looks like you or comes from a similar background can be a superhero. The second thing was to open more doors for people like us. As fun as it is to get into this superhero world where everything is dialed up to 110%, it's the characters that I've most related to. So obvious there, talking about his identity, specifically his skin color, people that look like him. Not about what the character's choices are, what the character's morality is, none of that stuff. None of that. It's all superficial, skin deep identity there. In July, Soto confirmed the film featured an illegal immigration allegory. Specifically, I think this was definitely a play on identity politics. He told Movie Maker there's a history that exists before an ICE raid, a history that includes traveling miles and danger, working hard, becoming a family, creating memories, and thinking that everything is going to be okay. I don't know. I mean, maybe there's that. A lot of the stories I read is you're basically separating families, and there's a lot of there is obviously a lot of danger, but I don't know if it's like becoming a family is one of the main things that happens during an ICE raid. And they're choosing to cross over illegally and being arrested by authorities. Rightfully so. But all of a sudden, everything that you have fought for, everything that you have worked for, everything that you have built is now burning. I needed the depiction to be triggering because it's the experience of many. So clearly playing on that as well, I think. And then we got a month later, at the beginning of August, he explained how one of the film's villains, Carapax, represents the, quote, unknown or forgotten or brushed under the rug history of interventionism in Latin America and the Caribbean. He told the playlist this was his initial idea for Bane and a Bane film when he pitched it to Warner Brothers, but he was unsure if he would ever get to work on Bane, so he chose to apply that backstory he made up for Bane to Carapax and Blue Beetle. I want to be clear, that is not the backstory for Bane whatsoever. Covered that in a previous video. I'm not going to get into that now, but that is not Bane's backstory. It's also not Carapax's backstory. It's some fictionalized backstory that he created that he wanted to graft onto these characters and push that message in the film, even though those characters are not actually attached to that backstory that he fictionalized in his own head. He said, as far as Bane goes, the comics that are about Bane's story, it felt like he's very misunderstood, much like Carapax in the movie. He is a product of his environment, and that history has been buried. The history of the Caribbean, the Antilles, it's a history that's brushed off in history books. So for me, it was very important to be seen. And with the character of Bane, the formation of this villain, I think in his own right, he's also a hero in his story. So whatever happens at the end that might have gotten distorted because of what was done to him, I think that what he represents is a lot of the unknown or forgotten or brushed under the rug history of interventionism in Latin America and the Caribbean. But while working on the character of Carapax, I was like, well, I don't know if I'll ever make a Bane movie. Let me take what I loved about Bane, about the backstory that I wanted to explore, and let's give it to Carapax. Because part of the idea was that maybe Carapax and Bane came from the same place. Pago Island, right? Again, no clue what he's talking about there. Carapax and Bane do not come from the same place. Maybe they do in the movie. Haven't seen it. Don't plan on seeing it. But maybe that's the case in the movie. But that's not what it is. That's not how it is in the comics or any other media. He goes on and says, because we need it when we're introduced to the world in movies, right, where we are seen as villains. It's just given that we are born that way. This seems like utterly ridiculous. He seems to think that all Latinos are seen as villains in movies or something like that, and they're born that way. I don't like just utter fictionalization in his own head and projecting that onto like movies. And when we talk about the history of Latin America, nobody dares to question, well, what happened before? Okay, well, what happened before? More times than none, when you go back even before 1954, but if we want to go to 1954 in Guatemala, it was U.S. interventionism that drove these places to the miseries that they're in. So I'm not embarrassed to talk about it. History is there. Nobody's trying to blame something. So I think he's definitely playing up the identity politics there. With that, and then shortly after that, he spoke to the Rap, and he questioned us seeing a Latino superhero of our own in Times Square is something that, if we're think about it, is that even possible? Now it's happening. Being able to not only be promoted in the areas where our community transmits, but to also be up there with the other big posters and the big movies just shows you the power that we have and that we can also be the heroes that we know we can be. I'm sure that there was a Zorro poster. I couldn't find one when I did search for it. I spent a significant amount of time looking for it, and I couldn't find one. But we did have Namor literally on a Times Square billboard just last year. So just kind of utterly ridiculous assertion here. Again, trying to play up this kind of victimhood mentality that just doesn't play out in reality. And then speaking with Collider, he said the film needed a theatrical release because it featured a Latino superhero, a Latino family, and highlights Latino culture differently than other films. He said, when I came into the project, the mandate was at the time everything goes to HBO Max, right? And I was like, sure, I'll do the movie, of course. It's a great opportunity. But I'm like, it can't be that the first time that we have a Latino superhero front and center. Not just a Latino playing a hero, but where he's a Latino, his family is Latino, and they're going to be actually being heroes of their own stories for the first time. I was like, it cannot just live on streaming. Like, he has to go to the theaters. Like, the whole experience of watching these fantastical movies is to be amazed and in awe. And what about being able to see our culture represented differently? So we worked very, very hard to do this world building where the action sequences that suit the passion of the family and the culture aspects are presented in a way worthy of watching it, not only in the theater, but even on IMAX. And being able to see our communities that way, I think we did an amazing job in bringing it to life on the concept development of it all. That at the end, Warner Brothers decided this movie has to go to theaters. Again, playing into that Latino identity that he's trying to market the film to. He then informed the outlet that the film featured the themes of displacement, colonialism, and gentrification. He said, I wanted this film because it is the first time you see a character that is Latino on the paper that his families are Latino. I really wanted to ground on the experiences that form a lot of us, right? Oftentimes in a lot of movies, our stories are told like the middle, in the middle of the sentence or in the middle of the paragraph, like boom, gangster, boom, you came out of prison. We have a chance to tell a story of where we come from and the stuff that really does affect us. So how can we introduce this character? Because this is what this movie is. It's like a first act of a potential saga that we wanted to create for the Blue Beetle journey. And one of the things that we wanted to do, first of all, was hire Mexican actors, not just Mexican Americans, but also go to Mexico and get like the best stars from Mexico for this movie, like Damien Alcazar or Adriana Barraza. And And they bring their own authentic experiences to the movie, and that helps a lot to inform the conditions we want to put the Reyes family in. We want the Reyes to live in a world that affects their environment, that affects their decision. So clearly identity-based there, and not only Latino this time, but specifically Mexican. And then he goes on and says, for example, in my case from Puerto Rico, displacement, colonialism, gentrification, those are things that are real threats. Home insecurity, not putting food on the table, proper health care, all those things that are villains. But at the same time, that we are all those things that are heroic, but at the same time, what are all those things that are heroic things like community, like standing up against a tyrant or standing up against the things that weaken us, but doing it through the power of family and community. So being able to hone in to those experiences that I know firsthand, that the writer also knows firsthand, because Gareth Danet Alcacer is from Querétaro, Mexico. We were able to find where our different journeys intersect in a similarity of experiences that not only affect our individual countries, but also affect countries in Latin America and abroad. So, laundry list of marketing done to pander to identity politics. Did not work. Film had a absolutely poor opening weekend. It'll be interesting to see whether or not it has any kind of legs. But I think the fact that it has such a poor opening weekend means that it will struggle to break even. I think the break even point is somewhere around like the 350 million mark potentially. So I think if you do a 2.5 times 120, that's where you're at. I think you're at like a 312, 315 around there. But we've also had a variety report saying it's actually 125 million. So that's putting you closer to that, I think, 350 million mark. And it does not look like it's probably going to do that, given it did less than 50 million globally in its opening weekend.